Welcome back, friends, to the Marc Claire Show. And for those of you watching the video anyway on YouTube, this one will be on YouTube. Why not? YouTube, BitChute, Odyssey, Rumble, anywhere and everywhere. I try to put the video out for you guys. For those of you watching on video, the studio you see around you, the original Marc Claire Studios, it's somewhat dilapidated. It's falling apart a bit, but that's okay. This is the last time I'm going to be in there. We're moving in a couple days, and there will be a brand new studio. So what better way to cap off an area, the Marc Claire Show V1, if you will, than by looking at one of the biggest topics of our time, certainly of our lifetime, of my lifetime anyway, and that is the subject of 9/11. This is one I brought up on the top five lies nearly everyone believes episode I did with Pete Quinones a few weeks back. So we'll be diving into that one today with, as far as I'm concerned, one of the absolute best researchers on this topic, Adam Fitzgerald. Before I get into that, I got to remind you, there's a reason I got so much energy. That's because I did have my Fox & Sons coffee this morning. I had some of the Brazilian honey prep, and it was quite delicious. You can check out all of their fine beans over at foxandsons.com, foxnsons.com. That's foxandsons.com. Use discount code MCS at checkout for 18% off your order. Once you try a sample bag, you're going to want to get a subscription. And right now, Stephen Fox is giving $4 per month off those subscriptions, which are already such a great deal. So head over to foxandsons.com. Help a good sponsor of the show, Stephen Fox, who is also teaching his sons about entrepreneurship with this business, hence the Fox and the Sons. Check him out, and don't forget to use that discount code MCS at checkout. With that being said, it's time for my discussion with Adam Fitzgerald. Welcome back, friends. My guest today is a 9/11 researcher and the co-host of the Darkened Hour podcast. I'm very pleased to welcome Adam Fitzgerald. Adam, welcome to my show.
Oh, thank you very much for having me, Marc. Thank you.
Well, certainly, Adam. And as we were talking about before the show, I was first turned on to you by my friend Tommy Salmons. He's got a great podcast over at Year Zero. You've done, I want to say, like 7 or 8 episodes with him on 9/11, something like that. So obviously, and as well as your own work, there's a ton to cover with the subject of 9/11. We're not going to come close to getting to all of it today, but we'll look at this as sort of an introductory, a 101 to some of the research that you've done on this subject. So before we dive all the way into that, I think the best place to start might be, well, you're from New York, as we were talking. You live in, I think, Brooklyn right now, and so I'm curious your own personal experience of 9/11. Where were you on 9/11, and then maybe you can transition into telling us a little bit about when you started to actually do research on this event.
Yeah, no. On September 11th. Oh, by the way, I was born in Brooklyn, but I live in Lower Westchester. But on September 11th, 2001, I was actually at work, and it was a job in Queens. And when I got radio, it was 1010 winds. It was on radio, and I heard that a plane had crashed in the World Trade Center. Now, at first, people didn't realize it was a commercial plane because there's only 2 camera shots of Flight 11 hitting the North Tower, and nobody really knew what happened. People didn't even see the plane because they were at a disadvantage either on the west, more of the west side of town, than they couldn't see the eastern trajectory of Flight 11. So really, nobody really knew what was going on until we saw the hole into the side of the building. We knew it wasn't a small plane. I live nearby where I work, so I ran home, and people would just, we just left work because the boss said, all right, we'll just shut down for the day because, this tragedy was going on. Got up on top of the roof, and if you're not familiar with Brooklyn, Queens, there are different tenements. There's like different story tenements, 3 floors, 4 floors, 5 floors. When I got to the 3rd floor, on top of the roof, and there was thousands of people on their rooftops, all across Brooklyn, Queens, Lower Manhattan. Then we saw the second plane crash into the South Tower. I couldn't see it from my advantage. I saw the big explosion come out of it, and we knew it wasn't a mistake or a commercial error. This was deliberate, and everybody, didn't know anything about Islamic terrorism or terrorism in general, but we knew that something was going on. Most of the day we spent on the roof, and because it was a good advantage to see, and then we saw the tower collapse, South Tower first, and then we were blown away. I mean, there was really not much to say. I remember distinctly that there was a silence across, and people were gasping a little bit, but it wasn't very. People weren't losing their head. It was just in shock. And then when the North Tower collapsed, it was just a near defeat of the consciousness of the people in New York. Days later, walking around in a daze. Most people, I didn't go back to work for another couple of days. It was less than a week, but it was a defeat, more so a defeat. But then all of a sudden it was anger. 2 weeks later, I noticed there was a rise in upticks of violence against Sikhs, Asians, and other Arabs and Sufis, and it was just out of ignorance. People wanted revenge, and people didn't know anything about Islam, and at this time, it was just ignorance. Years later, I was in Vegas and I was studying monotheism. I'm an atheist, but I was an anti-theist. I noticed that my way of thinking wasn't the right way because I became affiliated with one worldview. And I didn't, I just generally assumed that all religions are like this. And it was another atheist that basically said, you're very ignorant. And he's biblically literate. I really looked up to this guy. And I reflected. I said, yeah, why is he criticizing me? I'm like him.
Right.
And so for a while, this bothered me. And I remember not being on the internet for about 10 months, almost close to a year, because I wanted to self-reflect what was wrong. And what was wrong was that I was persuaded by a human construct to look at one issue and only agree with one issue because that issue agreed with me. And I didn't look at other worldviews, other issues that I didn't, I just generalized as wrong. And this was a wrong way to think. And when I made this transition, this is a big issue why I'm a researcher today, is that this transition made me look at the world not through one worldview, but to look at every worldview and then look at every construct and not apply these constructs to me, but to look at the world not through black and white, but as gray, because that's what it is. And that's what helped me in my research. This transition was long ago. I mean, it took me a while, close to a year, but I had to look at the errors of my life. So I said, I'm never going to look at this as with other area of the world again. And it just so happened around 2000, I'd say 5, 6, 9/11. And I couldn't tell you why. I think it was more of an interest because I came from New York. And I said, what do I really know? I want to, because I studied criminal psychology in college, forensic psychology, and it was always interest me, true crime. I have more books on true crime than 9/11. I have about 300 books on true crime. So I want to know why the motivation for these people more than, the how and stuff like that, or how the towers collapsed. I'm not a physics guy. So I'm more psychological. So I wanted to know who these people were. And to tell you that from that point, I looked at films like Loose Change or In Plain Sight. And I said, wow, I didn't know about the planes, the Pentagon that let so few debris. And, the plane, doesn't look like a plane at Shanksville. Well, this is not what I look like, a regular plane crashes where they leave large pieces of the plane and stuff. What I didn't realize was that I'm looking at it the wrong way. So when I looked at play the devil's advocate, and which is what I learned from monotheism. So I looked at Luke James and in plain sight, I saw some errors. But I didn't believe it right away, which was a big, I'm thankful for it. So I criticized, said, all right, I don't want to believe something, I want to know something. So what was wrong with this? And I studied this. What's wrong with this? And I took notes and stuff like that. And then I looked to see if it was right. And I found out they got some things wrong. In fact, they got most things wrong. Well, then, what do I believe? Well, I go back to the source. So I need to read documents and files. The research took enormous amounts of time because I went overboard. You didn't have to be like this, but I really went minutia. And most of the research I've done over the last 16 years is basically fact checking what I've learned over the years. Not reading what I learned over the years, but fact checking what I've read. So with every book that I've read, with every document that I've read, every file that I've read, I would have to go to the reference to find out where that information came from and connect the dots from there to see if it's legitimate or it's coming from a nefarious source. How do I know which is true? Do I go back to physical evidence, analytical evidence, eyewitness evidence? So I did all this, and this is what took most of the time. But I went, like I said, I went the extra mile, and because I'm signal and I have a lot of time on my hands, so I could read a lot more than the average person. And over the years, I became an overanalyzer of data. And that's what I am today. People ask me, am I a truther, debunker? I don't like labels. I consider myself an independent investigator of this specific point in history. That's all. I just took 9/11 and I didn't realize it would take me 16 years down the road. And I usually tell people I'm not an expert, I'm not a teacher, I'm still a student because I'm still learning.
Right.
And there's always something new because documents are hidden, they're classified, and over the years they're declassified. You learn something new each and every year. So you're always learning on the way. You're not, I don't like the term expert or professor or teacher in this area because I think that when something like 9/11, it's never really solved. We're still learning something new every day. On top of that, um, the direction it took me was a direction that I learned in life, and I'm very thankful for it because I don't I'm not persuaded by ideology, in other words. I'm not biased. I'm not prejudiced. And one thing I said when I researched 9/11, I promised myself two things. One was to never make money off it because when I got into 9/11, I saw so many people just asking for money to learn about things, and they were talking about trivial things. And I said, I want to help somebody. So I want to do it on my own time. And two, that I would try, and this is the most important lesson, was I wanted to try and remain steadfast in my honesty in reporting, because I also found that during that period of 2006, 7, 8, was that there was a bias in reporting the events of September 11th, 2001. In fact, it was a lot worse then than it was now, um, because the fringe conspiracies attributed to 9/11 are just as bad as the non-information from the government that put out there, and the incomplete reports of the 9/11 Commission and the Joint House Inquiry doesn't sit well with me either. So like you said before the show, I'm critical in both areas. So I'm looking at it as a nonpartisan, non-judgmental, non-biased investigator, which shouldn't everybody be looking at it that way? This way we can get further. We could probably solve a lot more crimes in the future. But it's unfortunate that a lot of people are persuaded by their own worldviews, by their own ideologies, to look at one set of information that agrees with their worldview. And hopefully, with this long winded explanation, I'm making sense as to how I started and what drove me to where I am today.
Absolutely, yeah, and I think that's one thing I really do appreciate about your approach to this whole thing is that so many of us, and I've been guilty of stuff like this before too. We get a whiff of something that's amiss on some event or another. We look into it, maybe we find that certain documentary. We see that documentary, and then we go, "Oh my god, oh my God. Well, now I know. Now I know.
Right.
Now I know everything. I know these guys, they put a 90-minute piece together that was well made and it triggered me. And especially if you're already in somewhat of an ideological place. For example, I come from the libertarian podcast world, and there's a strong, obviously, anti-government sentiment within that,
Yeah.
generally speaking, to the point that many people are very quick to want to say, well, obviously the government did this or that and is whatever, and in certain cases they probably did. So it's a valid idea to have in your mind as something that may have gone down, but I think so many people are ready to embrace it so quickly without actually analyzing it, without actually looking at what the truth is. And if you're going to do that, then at the end of the day you're sort of just as much of a propagandist as anyone that's just
Mm.
blatantly lying to you, because you're not taking the care to get the truth out there because it fits your ideology to just embrace the anti-government narrative right away. So I really do appreciate your approach to things. And like you said, I mean, by the way, so you're saying you have no monetization of any of your work here, anything you
None.
do. There's no way to even donate to you or anything.
No. I won't accept. People have wanted to give me donations, and I said, well, give it to a organization that's helping with the victims' families or something. But I won't take a dime.
Well, and as you said, I mean, that there are definitely many, many people in the quote unquote 9/11 truth realm who definitely take dimes, and lots of them. So that's I mean, I'm sure you probably could do the same work you do, generally speaking, and still make some decent money on it. But like you said, it can be corrupting as well. Then do I have to make a flashier video? Do I have to make a
Right.
more bombastic statement? And before you know, you can be doing and saying things, not even really realizing that your work is being affected by
Right.
the idea that you are going to get paid for it in some way.
Plus, I don't feel like I'm doing anything to earn the money anyway. I still use Movie Maker. I'm old fashioned. I still, I write articles. I have about 118 right now articles on Medium. I have 3,400 videos uploaded on YouTube. I have almost 100 episodes on the Darkened Hour. I have 5,700 documents files uploaded on WordPress. It only takes a couple of, an hour or two to do all this. I read most of the time. But uploading this stuff, it doesn't take much. So that's why I don't feel like I earn the money anyway. So it would be, as you said, I wonder if it would corrupt me. I just want to keep myself honest and humble to where I am now.
Well, you might be a little too humble because I can tell you, even though you might say it doesn't take a lot of work, it takes a lot of work to sit down, do a YouTube video, turn on the camera, upload, do all that stuff. So even if you don't feel like you're making it as fancy or flashy as maybe you could, trust me, I know it takes work. So it's definitely appreciated what you put into it.
Yeah, I don't. I said to myself, I got to get better. I shoot out my bedroom right here, so I don't have like a background and everything. And I say I don't care. I want people to see the human side of me, and that I am coming from a place where they can hopefully trust. I don't ask people to trust me either. I want people to actually, hey, do I want how do I know this guy's telling me the truth? And I always tell people, don't believe anybody, even me. I want you to take whatever points I'm making, you go and fact check, because that's exactly what I did. And that's how you build a movement. You build a movement of educated people, informed people, not people based on belief and conjecture.
All right, well then, why don't we dovetail into, and it's hard to know where to start with all this, and maybe I'll just toss that question to you. What is the best place to start when looking at 9/11? What are just some of the basic things that people need to know going into looking at this event?
The hardest question of all. Look, there is what I call a branch out effect when it comes to September 11, 2001. Unlike JFK, unlike RFK, unlike any other major event in history, 9/11 was the pretext of a lot of things. And what came after 9/11 was worse than 9/11, and it's still ongoing. I call whatever happening after 9/11 from this point forward, the rest of our lives and to the future generations, the ripple effect of 9/11. How would I do this? I would say probably you want to keep it recent, not lose people. The 1979 invasion of Afghanistan by the Soviet Union. Most of the major players of 9/11 came from this. When it comes to radical fundamentalism, when it comes to the intelligence services, how the intelligence services intergrained with radical fundamentalism, the foreign institutions that later persuaded American politics, like Israel, Saudi Arabia, the Gulf, that's Bahrain, United Arab Emirates, uh, the future plans of 9/11 came true through the pretext of foreign policy. Foreign policy guidelines are people who look at the world not like us. We're worried about what's happening right now, and this is meant to distract us. Foreign policy analysts look at the world 10, 20 years, 30 years down the road. They're playing the long game because they don't have the stresses of everyday life of everyday Americans like you and me. So they don't have to worry about worrying about their jobs or how to pay the rent, whether they're going to get food on time, whatever. These people are in very influential positions of power, high positions of government. They don't have the problems like we do. So they could concentrate on the longer run about how to shape policy of everyday Americans, how to shape policy of foreign governments and domestic government as well. And what they do is they persuade our Department of State, the military industrial complex, to play this long game of foreign policy. And what they do is basically they're influenced by two major lobbies, and that's Israel and Saudi Arabia. Israel is more political, whereas Saudi Arabia is more financial. So there's two different games here. Israel has a stronger connection to the United States because we have the largest Zionist lobby in the Zionist population in the United States, and that's the evangelical Christian. They're not Jewish. With Saudis, we don't share much in common. That's why they pay more money, and more money comes with more influence in politics. And what happens is with 9/11 is that with the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, this created a fanaticism that the United States brewed. They didn't create it, but they helped facilitate it. It's all they needed. Hey, look, you don't need to create a bad guy when there's already a bad guy who isn't strong enough. And all you're doing is giving him the necessary tools and means to become a stronger, better influence. And you know exactly what they're going to do. You know exactly what their capabilities are because, and this is speculation to a point, but not too crazy, you have contacts within these groups. It's not so hard to infiltrate a group like Al Qaeda or the Taliban or the Islamic State. Even though they have their own security apparatuses, they're not strict to the extent where you can have somebody in the Middle East act as an operator inside these groups to gain intelligence to find out what these groups are actually thinking. And so this is not too far outside the fringe. This is a conspiracy speculation, but it's reasonable speculation. There's a difference. So when you have these groups that are basically like Operation Cyclone, which was a CIA operation in Afghanistan that gave hundreds of millions, I think billions of dollars, and not just the United States CIA, which was going through the Pakistan ISI to help these groups get weapons and training and whatnot. And all of a sudden, these groups became bigger. And when the war ended, the Soviets retreated. Well, all these people with the training and the money that they provided, they went back to their home countries. Where'd they go? Well, Southeast Asia, Pakistan, Indonesia, Philippines, Great Britain, France, Germany, United States. And what happened was with this radical ideology that the United States knew what was brewing, they went back with all the training and all the funding and all the military weapon training, and they went back to their home states and they created themselves an enemy. And that enemy was radical fundamentalism, which has nothing to do with Islam as a religion. Nevertheless, that's a whole different argument and conversation in its own right. Nevertheless, the United States knew what they were doing because they replaced one enemy, which was the Cold War, Russia, Soviet Union, with another enemy. So this way, the war and the machine, Pentagon machine, will continue onwards. As Orwell said in 1984, war was never meant to be won. It's meant to be continuous. Well, here you have a transition from the Cold War to Arab fundamentalism. And this took up the next, I'd say, 10, 12 years right between. And what happens was it created terrorism inside the United States. So what came after the Soviet Union? Well, we had the 1993 World Trade Center bombing, which was basically the pretext for the war of Iraq. But we didn't basically go to war with Iraq, even though we had foreign policy guidelines blaming Iraq for the 93 bombing. One particular journalist, Laurie Malroy, basically threw propaganda into the media saying that, oh, there was an Iraqi who was in charge of building the bomb, Ramzi Youssef, because Ramzi Youssef used a fake passport, which was an Iraqi passport. He's not Iraqi. He's from Baluchistan, Pakistan. So he used an Iraqi passport. And the media and, of course, the neocons and of George Bush Sr. ran with it and tried to blame Iraq for the 93 bombing. From 93, we saw the elements of that bombing go to the elements of a Bajinka plot. Not many people know about the Bajinka plot. Marc, have you ever heard about the Bajinka plot?
This sounds familiar, but I can't say I can really say what it is. But the term sounds familiar.
Yeah, the idea of the 9/11 operation came from Bajinka plot. And the masterminds behind the Bajinka plot came from partly the mastermind of the 93 bombing, Ramzi Youssef, trained in Operation Cyclone, and his uncle, Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, who later is the alleged mastermind of 9/11. And what they wanted to do was basically put Timex bombing watches filled with nitroglycerin into 12 planes coming from the United States and from Southeast Asia to the United States and have them all explode over the Pacific at 1 minute intervals. And this would kill over 2,000 people. But that wasn't that was one phase. The second phase was to assassinate the U.S. President Bill Clinton, but his security detail was too strong. So what they did was they replaced Bill Clinton with Pope John Paul II because he was visiting the Philippines. Because Ramzi Youssef, after he built the bomb for the bombing of the World Trade Center, he fled to the Philippines, and they started working on Project Bajinka, Operation Bajinka. And he was visiting the Philippines. So what they were going to do was they were going to dress as priests and have a bomb in a bag and have his motorcade explode. Then there was a third phase of this operation, and it comes from an associate named Abdul Hakim Murad. And he basically was a pilot, and he was trained in the United States on flight training. And he was going to offer himself as a martyr instead of looking, because he said that now they're going to be looking for bombs. Well, why don't we just take the plane and crash it into the into CIA Langley headquarters? Then later on, there was a hidden compartment to this operation. And this is where the idea of 9/11 came from. And this came from the interrogation of Abdul Hakim Murad, because Operation Bajinka was uncovered when they were making bombs in the sink, and it created this black smoke, this thick, these guys didn't think right. So this thick black smoke came out of the windows and doors, and firemen came, policemen came. So Ramzi Youssef, who was helping Abdul Hakim Murad making these bombs, they ran, but they left the laptop, which was all the operation behind. and the names of all the people funding this operation. And so Ramzi Youssef told Abdul Hakim Murad to go back and get the laptop. And he did, unbelievably. And when he went up the stairs, they all looked. He ran away. They caught him. Anyway, cut right to the chase.
Wow.
They interrogated him, and he related a hidden compartment of Pachinko. And this was that there was a hidden cell inside the United States, and that they were going to hijack 10 planes and have them crash all over intercontinental United States using the pilots as maritime operations. Remember, this is 1995. And we're going to crash into Sears Tower, the Golden Gate Bridge, the Pentagon, the World Trade Center, Empire State Building, U.S. Capitol, the White House, and a nuclear facility. There was other programs as well. Now, the intelligence services, they were monitoring bin Laden's satellite phone. Now, remember, bin Laden's connected to all this somehow. And also, bin Laden's satellite phone he was using since 1992. And the CIA and the NSA was listening to this when he was living in Khartoum.
He used that
Sudan.
same phone for years?
He was using that phone from what we know from the public record from 1992 to 1998.
Seems like
that's a lot of calls.
That seems pretty weak for a mastermind.
Well, I mean,
he'd switch those out, or what do I know? But
in 1998 he did, and the reason why he did this is because the New York Times actually wrote in a report that bin Laden was using a satellite phone, and this
toss that over his shoulder. I guess
that was it. Yeah. That was it. But you would think, here's a guy using a satellite phone, which was bought from him at a Long Island storefront in New York, and it was shipped to him through a connect in Virginia, and it went to Tora Bora, Afghanistan, and to the Sudan where he was living. So, I mean, just imagine the amount of metadata. Now, the NSA doesn't hide this because they collected so much data. Now, the reason why I'm bringing this up and why this is all connected to 9/11 is that I'm trying to connect the radical fundamentalist part with the intelligence part, because the intelligence services knew about bin Laden many years prior, almost 10 years prior to 9/11, maybe even way further than that. But from the public record, we'll keep it recent. So from 1992 to 1998, they were listening to every single phone call. The amount of metadata is enormous. Anyway, one number kept popping up on this phone, and it was huge. This is the reason why. And this is the biggest point of 9/11, to me anyway. It's so big. So this number was traced back to Yemen. Who's calling bin Laden? Why is he calling this person? Finds out that this person's name is Ahmed Ahada. There's a nobody, but he knew bin Laden from Afghanistan days. Anyway, he owns a house in Yemen. And what happens is this became the global Al-Qaeda communications hub. In other words, if there's an Al-Qaeda operative living in Egypt who is so strict, Syria, so strict when it comes to listening to phone calls about radicals, because they hate radicals. Mm-hmm. So they would really repress them. They would put a call to this house and say, I need to have a message, and it would be coded or whatever, or send a message over this line to Yemen where they're not listening to the phone calls, because Yemen has the second biggest Al-Qaeda network in the world. And they would connect it to another Al-Qaeda somewhere in the world. So this went on for years. The NSA listened to the phone calls of this house from 1996 to 2000.
The house in Yemen where everything was running through? Okay.
Yeah. So they were listening to the phone calls, every single number from bin Laden's satellite phone, every single phone call coming out of this house. Now the CIA gets involved because they're like, wow, this is a big operation. We're going to be in charge of it. So they took over. So they put a bug in the house. So now you have two intelligence services listening to everything on the and also the CIA does what the NSA doesn't, is that human intelligence. Human, it's called in short. SIGINT is signal intelligence. So they're looking at all the people, taking pictures of people. So they know what's going on. Now the only thing we don't know is specifics. What were they talking about on those phone calls? Well, picture yourself as an Al-Qaeda operative. Are they going to be like you and me, talk about the Yankees, the mundane things? No, these are serious men. They're talking about operations, talking about people involved with operations, talking about where the money is coming from. So I'm putting that idea in your head to think that, all right, what were they talking about in these things? What came from them? Well, after that came the 1990 East Africa bombings, Millennium Plot of 2000, and 9/11. Now, I can't prove that they knew about 9/11 beforehand. So in this long-winded answer, it's really hard to answer the question about where to start from, but with the without going all totally off the rails and branching out, I would say 79 invasion of Afghanistan, 93 bombing of the World Trade Center, Bajinka plot, 98 East Africa bombings, Millennium plot, 9/11. And what you'll get from all this is how radical fundamentalism and the intelligence services intertwine. And then it'll start to make sense.
Okay, so
And I hope I didn't lose you with that long answer.
no, not at all. This is all the groundwork we need. So you're saying, are you saying then that if they were already listening at that time before the Africa bombings, for example, would you assume that it's quite an assumption you could make that the intelligence services knew about that as well before that happened?
This is a tough question. Now, look, it would be not unreasonable to speculate. And
Okay.
believe me, use that with a grain of salt, huge grain, to say that was the 98 East Africa bombings talked about in these phones? Very well could be. Not only that, you already had an operative that was involved with the East Africa bombings named Ali Muhammad. And I don't want to lose the viewer or the listener. Ali Muhammad was an informant for two intelligence services, the CIA and the FBI. He was also a radical fundamentalist. So he was playing three agents.
A triple agent, you could say.
Yeah, he was a triple agent. He's currently in WITSEC. We don't know what happened to him. It's been 22 years after 9/11. We have never heard from him again.
Like he'd be working at a Starbucks now or something, probably now.
I don't know what he's doing. He could be dead. I don't know. But he's a huge, major player in all this because he is from the Afghan war, because he was trained from there. He came to the United States, became involved with training at Fort Bragg, North Carolina. Then he went to with Bin Laden, trained some of the people involved with the 93 bombing, trained with some of the people involved with the 98 East Africa bombings. I mean, this guy's all over the place, but he's not alone. There were other informants and operatives that came out and said, tried to warn intelligence officials, hey, there's a bombing going to happen in Africa. Weeks before, an Egyptian involved with the bombing said, listen, there's a cell inside your head. So in other words, not only can we speculate that they probably knew or didn't know, we don't know the specifics, but you had warnings. And one warning came from Prudence Bushnell, who is a U.S. ambassador to Kenya, who basically said that the security apparatus of the United States found that there were lapses and there was warnings about bombing, embassies, no stricter security measures. Sound familiar? That's exactly what happened with 9/11, where there was warnings all throughout 2000, 2001. Hey, Bin Laden's going to try to attack the United States, and he's attacking the airline services. No stricter security measures. Lax. So that's about as definitive as I can answer regarding that.
Right. So I mean, it's as you kind of say, like, because we can't listen to the calls, we don't know what they actually heard on there, so we can't really prove in any way. Okay, they definitively heard this, and then they said, "Well, we're just gonna not do anything about it."
Right.
But it's reasonable to assume that if that was the main hub of all this and of all these operations we're going through, and then all these operations happened, and we know they were being listened to, it's not a reasonable, what you called it. It's reasonable to speculate, at least.
Yeah, and also I'm so glad you brought this up. Thank you very much. Because why? And you're asking, so all right, why would they want these attacks to happen? Think about what I said before about foreign policy. Not everybody's a ghoul, all right, but you do have certain people that are persuaded by the long run and say, well, if we allow these attacks to happen, we could basically take advantage. And if you have a stake in a military industrial complex like Halliburton or LG3 Technologies or Raytheon or Boeing, or maybe you have high contacts within somebody persuasive in Israel, Saudi Arabia, basically saying, maybe we could want this to happen, or maybe it's so compartmentalized that you don't know what's basically going to happen. Maybe you're trying your best to track these people, but you lost track of them because you're not getting the proper information. There's so many variables at play, but very few people, I would say, very few, I'm confident, that would want these attacks to happen. But the majority of the people that would want these attacks to happen are from the United States. And I'm going to be careful about the two countries that I mentioned previously that would benefit them very greatly.
So again, I think you can look at who will benefit. I think what you said earlier is pretty interesting, that about how there's these foreign policy guys. I don't know, you might call them like a Brzezinski, Kissinger, this type of person, I
Yeah.
suppose,
Mhm,
who's
mhm.
they're, hanging out. They live a totally different society than us. They're not worried about, even forget, like, paying the rent, or they're not even worried about if there's a bombing here or shooting here. Like, these are not
Mm.
things that are going to affect them at all. And if they're looking at things on a sort of global, long-term 30, 40-year out scale,
Yeah.
yeah, sure, who cares about a stupid ship getting bombed or this building blowing up or some civilians dying, if these little pieces, if these little movements, if these little events here and there can lead to our longer term goals of controlling this region or getting involved here. If that will play into those goals, to someone with that mindset, a little bombing here and there, might not bother them at all.
Compare 9/11 to the invasion of Iraq in 2003, and it pales in comparison. 3,000 people died. That's a tragedy. It's
It's an
enormous.
afternoon in Iraq during that war.
Well, then what does that mean for Iraq? Right. A million. And that's being liberal with the number. And we won't know the definitive number. According to Human Rights Watch, it's 1.4 million. If we go by Amnesty International, it's 1.2 million. We really don't know the definitive number, but it's a lot more than a million, because look who we bombed. We bombed Iraq. We bombed Afghanistan. Afghanistan, the longest war in U.S. history. After that, I mean, we got Obama. Hope and change. Well, nothing changed and nothing was hopeful, because we bombed Syria and we bombed Libya. And from there, we drone strike Pakistan. So the Middle East became the victim in all this, not just the United States. In fact, they were the bigger victim of 9/11 than the United States was.
And there are obviously sort of like many little detailed rabbit holes to go down within the looking at the idea that of the intelligence networks, what they knew, when they knew it, who within what knew, what agency knew about what. There's a lot of different directions you can go, but at the end of the day, I think your general thesis, and I don't want to put words in your mouth, so I'll let you expound, is
Sure.
that at a minimum, it's very likely that 9/11 was known about to an extent enough that it was at the very least allowed to happen by some within the intelligence community. Now, going further than that, there are people that will go further than that. I don't think you do, but would that be your overall, like, if you're just going to take a big picture view of your work, would you say that that is the general premise that you would accept at this point, that it was at least allowed, at least by some elements of intelligence?
I will answer it like this. I can make a very good argument, to the best of my ability, that they allowed this to
I
happen.
appreciate how careful you are with the way you phrase things like this.
I have to be,
Because
because I don't
most
want to
people
be.
in the truther world are not. They say
No,
George
I
Bush did
understand.
this guy did. They just
Yeah,
put it all out
yeah,
there.
yeah.
So,
Well, I mean, yeah, I can make a very good argument that they allowed it to happen, and that's being very bold, right? Because all right, who's involved with the allowing it? Because you can't say the entire intelligence community. That's out the window. So, all right, now you got to be specific, and to be specific, you got to have information. You can't just say, like you said, it's easy to blame George Bush, Tom Rumsfeld. Let me tell you something. George Bush doesn't know nothing. Don Rumsfeld doesn't know nothing. They know the basics. And you know why? Is because they're in front of a TV camera.
mhm.
The people who would know specifics are the people that don't want to be known, that aren't out in the public face or the public sphere, and less likely to be known by anyone involved with the public sphere. Is because that's how you could compartmentalize a crime. And in a
You don't
crime like
want the
this,
public facing figures to really know
sure,
everything. You just want them to
right.
be okay. Go out to say the thing you have to say. You want them to have the plausible deniability of genuinely not really knowing about this stuff. I would think anyway.
Oh, there you go. You just hit the point on the head. Plausible deniability. In other words, Bush may know an attack is upcoming,
Mhm.
because there was a document, and it's most infamous known as the August 6th Presidential Daily Brief, with a PDB, where it says Bin Laden determined to strike inside the United States, and it basically warns about, hey, Bin Laden is going to strike the United States, but it didn't get specific. It just warned about it. Now that's all President Bush needs to know. All right, there's going to be a strike. All right, well, you could say that. All right, he knew that much. Go further. I dare you, because you won't be able to make that connection. There's no proof that he knew that plane was going to be hijacked on September 11th, 2001. In fact, I would say very few people knew. But the people that knew probably are not out in front of the TV and act like an idiot like President Bush is. Do you want that guy knowing everything? No. Anyway, but yeah, I would say I can make a very good argument that few people in the intelligence services wanted this to happen, and few people in foreign policy analysts wanted this to happen. And I don't think they knew about the specifics either.
Right. They just
Right.
know maybe there's a something brewing, and if
And to
whenever
take advantage.
whenever that
To take advantage.
pot
Right.
boils
They're
over. Right.
opportunists. They're opportunists.
I like to look at maybe we've talked about okay, what maybe kind of the government angle of it, what the intelligence agencies might have been in on. I want to kind of pivot over for a minute because, like we talked about earlier,
Hmm?
you're very critical of a lot of the 9/11 truth movement. So let's just start with Loose Change, actually, because that's the first movie I saw that I didn't have a inkling of a conspiracy thought in my mind, I think, at that point in my life. And I stumbled upon that video. And yeah, I was like, whoa, like, there was stuff in there that just made me go, hold on. And I think there's probably, I don't know, it's hard to say because I haven't watched it in a long time. So there's a lot of specifics I probably don't really even recall. But it certainly sent me down a rabbit hole of sorts. But I'm curious, what are some of the things in that film that now that you are far enough removed on it, you said they got some things. Well, why don't we start with this? That you said they may have got a few things right. Is there anything you actually think they do have right, or are on to something right in whether you want to talk about Loose Change or just like out there in the 9/11 truth community? Are there areas where they're on to the right things that you can think of?
Sure. And this is an excellent question because usually people want to concentrate on what was wrong, and that's a long list. But the right things they got right was that there was a conspiracy involving the federal government at the White House level, State Department level. Regarding the intelligence community, few things they got right there. There was a conspiracy involving a willful um, not willing to share all the information with other intelligence services. So they wanted to pour light on this. And one thing I will get the biggest I think I guess the biggest praise I could give the film is that it did help with a global consciousness of getting people outside to think, hey, wait a minute, something is wrong here.
Mhm.
The major takeaway from it was that they looked in the wrong dead ends. It was a dead end of what they were looking at, but it did tell people, hey, look, this narrative that the government had, not only is it wrong, but I would say that that's not the way to look at it either. But it's also there's another narrative to it, and this is the conspiracy narrative. The things that they got wrong was that there was a lot of minutia that they just went off the rails on in terms of like no plane in the Pentagon, no plane crash Shanksville, living hijackers, phone calls being faked. All that is wrong. And anyway, what happens is when you don't have hijackers, when you don't have phone calls, when you have fake planes, when you don't have plane crashes, you don't have a crime. You have a half, what I call a half a crime. In other words, there might have been hijackers planning this to be out, but they didn't, from September 11th forward, they didn't hijack the planes. They were somehow switched, or they were somehow missiles, there was somehow CGI. What happens is all of a sudden, if this happens, when you don't have hijackers, you don't have the intelligence services monitoring these people. When you don't have the intelligence services monitoring these people, you don't have a connection between them and the foreign governments involved with policy. And if you don't have all of this, you don't have the invasion of Iraq, you don't have the invasion of Afghanistan, you don't have the Patriot Act, you don't have none of these things because nothing is the pretext for anything. So, in other words, now you're stuck before 9 you're stuck at ground zero. You're stuck at the Pentagon. You're stuck at Shanksville, and there's no forward movement. There's no progression. In other words, when a person believes these certain conspiracies, fringe conspiracies, there's no forward momentum, no forward learning. In other words, they don't learn anything new because it's attached to this area which they call the official narrative. And from my experience, Mark, and it could be wrong for you. It could be different for you. It could be a bit from my experience in dealing with the fringe element of the truth movement. The fringe element of the truth movement thinks that the official narrative is the following: that the World Trade Centers 1, 2, and 7 came down by a natural progression. I'm sorry, yeah, a natural progression of fire, and that 19 fundamentalists hate our freedoms, hijacked 4 planes and crashed them into World Trade Center, Shanksville, and the Pentagon. That's it. There is no before, there is no after. To them, the official narrative is this one very narrow doorway, and they concentrate on it.
So they look at it in a bubble. So they're missing all the context around it, is what you're saying.
And because of their worldviews that I mentioned, which I thought is very important to understand, because they are so distrustful of the government, and because a lot of these people, you'll notice the backgrounds that these people are very distrustful of the government and blame the government before even investigating 9/11. They only looked at certain information that agreed with that worldview and found or created these fringe conspiracies of missiles, CGI, hologram, to make the government this big, nebulous, monolithic, or omniscient, omnipresent entity, when the reality is they're just human, just like us. But the evil is their apathy.
In some ways,
and what they're willing to do.
In some ways, you could say that they're kind of worshiping the state in a way, because they're the ones turning it into this like all-powerful, all-seeing, like sort of monolithic entity, as opposed to humans that have incentives, and many of which are powerful, and many of which do bad things. But that's different than being one sort of entity that moves as a hive mind.
Right, exactly. And what this does is create. And the irony of their position is that they think they're doing harm to the state, but they're helping it, because you're not looking at the right information that can actually show a real conspiracy with 9/11. It's huge, but they are blanketed by these ridiculous fringe theories. So the truth movement basically does more harm than good. Now, this is not a generalization of the truth movement, because I met certain truthers that are vilified by fringe elements. People like David Chandler and Wayne Costi and Ken Jenkins. These are, reputable people that have good, reputable backgrounds that don't believe in the crazy stuff, but they're actually criticized by their fellow truthers that believe in the fringe elements, because they're very cultish, these people. They're very loyal to their groups until you break out, and then they show no loyalty at all. So in other words, there's a lot of infighting, fraternal fighting. In time, what this did was, because people don't learn anything new, because they're so fraternal and sectarian, it destroyed the truth movement from within. And the truth movement of 2006, 7, when Loose Change came out, was so strong. Now they're non-existent, because these people don't learn anything new, and they don't have organization anymore. And a lot of these organizations too, like Loose Change had a forum. There was a forum called Let's Roll Forums. Apollo 9/11 Truth. All these.
I've been in all of those in my day. I'm pretty sure. Back.
Oh, did you?
Oh, yeah, back.
So
in
you're
my
familiar with these groups?
Yeah.
They were huge. Now, no, they're all defunct.
It's like before social media, I was in all these, just going through these weird forums, and I was pretty obsessed with 9/11 for a while. Not to the extent of doing research in the right way like you do, but reading like everything I could find on it.
Sure. And these were big names. Loose Change is still the most popular 9/11 film in the world. At the time, they were like rock stars. Jason Bermas, Dylan Avery, and Corey Rowe, they were huge. And I think because they were young, it allowed them. I know I'm very critical of them, but I'm not doing it because I'm an asshole. I hate to curse, but I'm trying to help them. Listen, we need you to be right, because we need an educated public. And what you did was you created more damage than good. And we need you to rectify that. And they've refused to do it. So I'm a very open, not as much as I used to be, but I'm a very harsh critic when it comes to fringe conspiracy, because they do more harm than good. Because I had this naivety in me. I don't know, just this naivety in me, even though I'm a pessimist, that we're going to get some form of justice one day. Because if I stop believing that, is when I stop studying 9/11.
What do you think justice would look like then? Would you see it as actually like literally identifying actual individuals that definitively we can point to? You knew about this, you allowed it to happen, and we're going to bring charges of some kind. Do you think that's actually feasible in some way?
I think the only successful trial that we have is currently now, and it's in the Southern District of New York, with the civil litigation case against Saudi Arabia. And this is coming from two law firms, Motley Rice and Creedler and Creedler. They're representing the 9/11 victims' families. Groups like 9/11 Justice, headed by Brett Eagleson. I just interviewed him. 9/11 Peaceful Tomorrows by Elizabeth Miller. I interviewed her. There's other like activists. I mean, the best activists in the world. Marc Fallon, Aldo Brackham, uh, um, uh, um, God, Dan Christensen, a Florida Bulldog, Mohammed Al-Slahi, a former Guantanamo prisoner of 16 years. I had the honor of interviewing him. He's an activist now. There's a lot. Maria Hartwig of Althea organization. There's a lot of like names, activists, big names. Mansour Afridi is another one who's a former Guantanamo detainee. There's a lot of activists out there. Like I said, Dan Christensen, both Florida Bulldog. So they're out there. These are the biggest names out there. I mean, I'm missing some, but there's no other trial. Now, I have an idea, and my idea is something that I don't think anybody's come up with, dare to say, and that is to request a Freedom of Information Act on the transcripts of what was said on those phone calls at the Bin Laden satellite phones and the Al Qaeda communications hub. From my studying of 9/11, I have never seen anyone do this. I messaged Thomas Drake, the former senior executive at NSA and the most important whistleblower of my time. And I told him, I said, Tom, is it realistic? I messaged him on Twitter. I said, Tom, is it realistic to file a Freedom of Information request requesting this? And he told me this. He said, it'll be hard on you. It'll be protected under some executive order and probably is classified, most definitely. And it'll be very hard. And I said, damn it. A friend of mine named Bob Brotherton looked up the executive order and said, look, there's a 25-year warrant, like 25-year expiration date on the Bin Laden satellite phone. He said, we probably could, but it's going to be classified because we're just regular citizens. But he said, it wouldn't hurt to try. And I put it off. And I said, I'm going to need lawyers for this. And that's hard to do. Who wants to take up a case? It's going to be risky. Can we get it? So I'm going to wait until what this trial in Southern District of New York looks like. And it's going to be finalized in October, whether the judge actually agrees to continue the case or not. As for the biggest trial in our lifetime, which is the Guantanamo trial, the 5 guys allegedly masterminds in 9/11.
Right, they've been there for 20 years now. I mean,
older than some of the people born after 9/11. They're there. Hey, listen, that's another argument. Like, how much did they know? How much planning did they go on to? Because if they're guilty, like the government says so, there was no need to torture these people. And so, even like I said, even if they admitted their part, even if they were guilty, hey, I orchestrated 9/11. How can we believe them? Because they were tortured. And I think the CIA did this so that the public consciousness doesn't make a decision, a right decision of yes or no. They want us to believe they're evil. They want us to believe they're guilty, but they also want to believe that there could be some doubt that they're innocent. In other words, indecision, because indecision paralyzes us.
To confusion and more conspiracy and whatnot.
You got it. Mm-hmm. With paralyzation comes inaction.
All right. Well, there's a few areas I want to kind of look at, probably areas that are, I would say, the most glaring on the maybe conspiracy side of things, and things that have, to me, looked the most suspect. And maybe we won't get to all of them here. Maybe we'll save some of them for the smoke-filled room, the bonus segment. But, well, first I want to look at some of the individuals that maybe seem suspect. One individual in particular that is pointed out in the Loose Change documentary, and that is Larry Silverstein, who owned both the World Trade Center towers. And I believe, I don't have this stuff in front of me, but I believe it wasn't that long before that there was some renewed insurance policy. And so for a lot of reasons, he has become someone has seen as a suspicious figure, at least by the Loose Change sort of like 9/11 truth crowd. So do you have any thoughts on Larry Silverstein?
It's such a dead end. Okay. And I'll tell you why. I think he's suspicious as heck. Okay. But that doesn't mean a damn thing. What Loose Change tried to do was connect him to foreknowledge of the events of September 11, 2001. I don't know how they did this, but to imply this in a film it takes guts. And, they weren't definitive, but it goes like this. Silverstein Properties wanted to lease the World Trade Center for 99 years because the owner of the World Trade Center is the Port Authority. They own the World Trade Center. They own the land. So there was a 99-year lease that was up for bid, and Silverstein Properties lost in, I think, March of 2001. The original winners of the bid were Vornado Realty. And they actually won the bid by, I think, $33 million more than Silverstein Properties. However, they argued about certain provisions within the lease. I don't know the specifics of it, but what happened was they pulled out of the deal. So when they pulled out, Silverstein Properties was the next up, and they won the rights to lease the property. However, Silverstein Properties, along with Westlake Incorporated, which was co-joined with Silverstein Properties, they didn't have enough money. So they got, I forgot the name of the person that gave them like this loan to, lease the 90-year lease. And basically they got the rights to 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and Larry Silverstein actually owns World Trade Center 7. That's the only building he actually owns. So what happens was they got the year lease, and in August of 2001, because the World Trade Center was a previous victim of terrorism in 1993, of course there was always that the threat matrix, and of course with lawyers and with intelligence services that were involved, they basically gave reports to these insurers and said, yeah, the World Trade Center has always been a target, and we want you to take the proper necessary security apparatuses to ensure your building doesn't become a threat. So they hired a number of different security apparatuses. One was Securicom, which of course, on top of involved with the board of directors was a Governor Jeb Bush of Florida. He left in 2000, so he wasn't involved with 2001. So he left, but they were in charge of camera security, and there was also security provided by Port Authority, and of course, Kroll. Kroll is physical security involved. There was a lot of layers involved. So Loose Change basically said that, Silverstein took out this insurance policy for terrorism insurance in August 2001, and that's suspicious. No, it's not, because you had the threat daily matrix reports coming in that's saying the World Trade Center, because it was a previous terrorism victim of terrorism in 93, it should be, that you take out insurance terrorism to ensure that if you in the future have insurance, if you're becoming a victim of terrorism again, you're properly insured. And damn it to be, this goes with every major building in New York, not just with the World Trade Center, Empire State Building, World Trade Center 7, a lot of big buildings, Chrysler Building, big building, Empire State Building too. They have terrorism insurance. Why isn't anybody talking about that? So they have this terrorism insurance for all these buildings because they're all part of the threat matrix in New York. So it wasn't as suspicious. Now, what's suspicious is every day Silverstein's on top of the restaurant. I forgot the name of the restaurant. Forgive me. That he goes for breakfast every day. On September 11th, he wasn't there. That's why I would consider him suspicious. Now, could I make the leap and say, oh, he got a call by somebody saying, don't be there? I can't go that far. But what I can say is that could that possibly have happened? Absolutely, because he wasn't there. Now, of course, he made a dermatologist appointment because his wife reminded him, say, don't forget your dermatologist appointment. Just so happens on September 11th, 2001. That's as far as I'm going. For him saying, pull it, the building, demolition of his own building. I'm not a physics guy. I don't go this route because I would probably say go to somebody who's much more qualified to speak on this, and because I'm not an authority on this, and I'll self-admit that much. I don't talk about the demolition or 1, 2, and 7. Could there have been bombs? I think there were because people heard explosions in all 3 of these buildings. I mainly deal with data.
Did you say you do think that you do think there were, or you don't?
I think yes. Listen. I interviewed David. For example, I'll do this, so I won't not answer it. David Chandler once told me, think of it like this: if the planes crashed into the World Trade Center and they somehow stood, what would this mean subliminally? And he had told this, what would this mean subliminally? What kind of message? And I thought about it. I said, I don't know. Well, what could it be? He goes, it would say, we took your best shot, and now it's our turn. Mm. But with the collapse of the 2 biggest and strongest buildings in the entire United States, New York being, the big braggot tough, we're the toughest in the whole country. We're braggadocious. These are the biggest buildings on earth. They're the financial capital of the world. When those towers came down, it sent the message, and it said, we destroyed your buildings. And if we could get to them, we could get to you anywhere in the world. And what this did was it created a subliminal consciousness of defeat and this change in New York. And I live in New York. Okay. Yeah, I moved to Vegas. I came back to New York, and I could tell you this: it's a completely different New York. It's not as braggadocious. It's a tourist capital. A lot of this tough guy attitude, it's gone. That was destroyed once those towers came down. So I understood what he was telling me. And I said, what would ensure it? Could they possibly just have the faith that it would just be the planes? And that's why I believe, I don't know it, but I believe that there were bombs in the building that went off. I can't tell you definitively whether because it's not my area. Go to people like Wayne Chandler, go to people like Ken Jenkins, David Chandler, Tony Zambotti, go to those people. I couldn't tell you. Now, if you want to be right, if you want to play devil's advocate, you go to NIST, both sides, somewhere in the middle, someone's telling the truth. That's how I do it. Play devil's advocate. Don't go by one side. Don't go by the other side. Somewhere in the middle is the truth. But I don't do this because I'm terrible in physics. I'm good with geopolitics, I think, and I'm not an expert there, but I'm much more confident in that area. But yeah, I do think to ensure the building collapsed, there was bombs.
Interesting, and that adds a whole nother layer of questions of how they got there, and maybe who knew about bombs, and do they intentionally leave that out of the investigation because they want it to just be focused on the planes, the planes. We don't want to think about what else might have been involved in getting all that. But whether you like it or not, Adam, just you saying you believe it's possible, even to many people, would put you, no matter what, in the realm of crazy, wacky conspiracy doodle. So.
Yeah, I think I lost a prospective interview because they were afraid, because I interviewed people like Adam Taylor and David Chandler, and because I allowed them to speak their mind, but I didn't go up to crazy fringe because they're not crazy fringe. So I think that scared away certain people. But also I want to harp on something too, and I'll just make it real short. How did they get the bombs in the building? How is this possible? Now,
this the loose change explanation, I think, is something with a George Bush connected security company and maybe thermite paint or something like that. I imagine you don't buy that theory.
No, I don't. Look, you don't need to go that far. The main goal of all intelligence services is to collect information by whatever means: human, signals, illegal, legal. Just get the information. Okay. If we go back to those phone calls, if we had to speculate that they knew that these attacks were going to happen, that they knew these specific targets were picked, well, you can manipulate the plot. In other words, what I'm saying is, you may have somebody in the intelligence service hearing about specifics, telling somebody, whoever that is, their supervisor. That supervisor goes to foreign or domestic governments at the highest levels, only the highest levels, and relay that information. We need this to happen. In other words, all right, we know they're going to pick the World Trade Center, for example. Let's make sure these towers came down. I'm speculating here, not speaking on factual information. In other words, I'm trying to give you a gauge of how these bombs could have been there prior to 9/11. If they knew these operations were going to take place, if they knew these targets were going to be selected. And I can't say because, like you said before, we don't know what's on those phone calls. That's why I'm trying to say, if somebody more powerful than me, somebody who has major influence, can get those transcripts, we can know about 9/11. Right there, to me, this is the backbone of 9/11. Did they know? Was 9/11 planned on those phone calls? Either it's Al-Qaeda or it's not. It's either or. We'll know when we listen to those phone calls. Because if Al-Qaeda doesn't talk about 9/11, then that means Al-Qaeda either didn't talk about 9/11 or wasn't involved in 9/11. Then who the hell are these people? If they were talking about 9/11 and they spoke on these specific targets and the intelligence services didn't tell us, well, then guess what? Now we could blame either way. It's a pro or con. In other words, there is a conspiracy, either way you look at it. But when you don't if you go off the rails and start just blaming the government for all these crazy things, they could do whatever they want. It's like, I wish 9/11, I always say this, I wish 9/11 was as simple as they make it out to be, because I wouldn't spend 16 years pulling out my hair, whatever I have left out of my head, trying to get the information and trying to find out what's true and what's not. And so I wouldn't, just, I would sit back and relax. Oh yeah, thermite. Oh yeah, CGI. You know how easy that is? It's so easy because you have to explain it.
Right.
And if you say, well, prove holograms, you can always say, here's a link, Judy Wood,
Right.
Christopher Bolin, and because that's how they learned. They were given a link, they saw the film, it acquiesced to their worldview and said, yep, that's what I believe.
But it reminds me so much of, coming out of the libertarian podcast world. There's a lot of, not in the podcast world, but in the libertarians, in argumentation and whatnot, you see a lot of, just go read Human Action. Just go read this Rothbard book. And so it reminds me of the same sort of attitude. Like it's something like, well, I've been enlightened by whatever it is, this documentary, this book, this philosophy, and I get it because I've seen it. Of course, if I just get everyone else to see it, they'll see things the same way I do. That's not true. First of all, people watch the same shit and come away with completely different thoughts on it, or read the same things and what have you. But it's also just not how humans work. You don't just show them a link and show them a book, even if it changed your mind about something, and then they copy and paste your beliefs onto it. That doesn't work at all, especially when you're doing it in this case, maybe in the case of libertarians too, you're doing it in a somewhat aggressive manner often.
My goodness. Looking at it from that perspective, I can understand how certain truthers can look at, like, I'll give you a great example. I'll make it real short. A year ago, Ed Brotherton, a friend of mine from We Are Change LA, formerly of We Are Change LA, he once said, I'm going to have you come in a room and explain 9/11 to two, truthers for 9/11. Well, I'm not going to name their names because I don't want to shame them. And I said, I'll give you an hour. Explain the 9/11 to them. And I said, I don't know if I could do it in an hour. I did. I tried my best. The first question I got was from this one woman who basically looked at me and said, can you simplify it? And I told her, I just did.
Here's a link.
I just did. And that's when I knew that answer right there. I understood the mindset of the fringe truth movement. I said, oh my God, they're in big trouble. Right. Because if that is too complex for them, I can only imagine if they looked at 9/11 without those truth and they looked and said, holy crap, what did I miss? And if they only knew that the conspiracies that they didn't acknowledge, and they finally acknowledged, it's bigger than all the conspiracies they believe combined, because all that is fruitless nonsense. And it does show that there is a bigger, wider network of conspiracy, but it's much more human rather than, this ghostly image of 9/11 and the government that they make it out to be.
Well, Adam, I mean, there's a number of little areas I'd like to go into you with, but we're going to save that, I think, for the bonus segment, the smoke-filled room. I'm going to ask you about some of the weirder aspects of 9/11 and get your thoughts on that. But as we wrap up here, I'll give you one more chance just to give any final thoughts if you like, and as well as feel free to plug away on everything you got going on.
Well, I guess the final thoughts would be advice. My advice to you is that when you look at any human event, it doesn't have to be 9/11. Don't look at it with any preconceived worldviews. Look at it like a crime scene, like you're an investigator. You go to a crime, you collect the evidence, and you don't make any prejudgments before you investigate. So in other words, you can't place blame on anybody. And that's why I say look at 9/11. Look at it with a clean slate. And then collect the evidence. And this way, whatever the evidence leads to, whether it's United States, just the United States, or just Israel, or just Saudi Arabia, or a combination of all three, well, then that's where it leads to. And you can actually go to sleep knowing that you investigated responsibly. And as for plugging away, you could just Google my name, Adam Fitzgerald 9/11. I come right up. Or you can go take a shortcut. Go to Twitter, _Adam Fitzgerald, Twitter. And I have a pinned tweet of all the links to all my sites.
All right. Well, Adam Fitzgerald, thank you so much for coming on my show. I really enjoyed it.
Oh, thank you, Marc. Thank you very much.
All right, friends, I hope you enjoyed my discussion with Adam Fitzgerald. The discussion continued, as always, for premium subscribers over in the Smoke filled room where we dug into some of the wilder, more unbelievable aspects of 9/11, including the quote unquote magic passport. We talked about Building 7 and the BBC reporting its collapse minutes before it happened. We even talked about anybody looking around here? The dancing Israelis. That's right. We talked about the dancing Israelis, all in the smoke-filled room for Marc Clair Show premium subscribers. You can support the show if you enjoy the product I'm putting out for you. I do my best to produce a show I would want to hear. So if it's one you want to hear and want to continue to hear it, you can hear even more of it behind those paywalls. You can find out all your options over at marcclair.com. That's MarcClair.com. I really do appreciate all of the support. And there are several ways you can support the show. I don't really care how you do it. Each have their bonuses, their pluses and minuses, whatever's easiest for you. You can do Patreon. You can do Subscribestar. You can support me on Rockfin, where you get access to 400 other creators as well. So there's a plethora of options for you. Find them all at marcclair.com. Until next time, my friends, from what will be a brand new, maybe getting built up in the middle of the process, Marc Clair Show Studios. Until next time, in case I don't see you, good afternoon, good evening, and good night.